We're live. Go ahead, Charles.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to another extraordinary event put on by the American Interest magazine. I'm the publisher, Charles Davidson. The editor-in-chief, Jeff Gedman, is here, but asked me to introduce this event because I guess he's feeling lazy today or something. I don't know exactly why. But anyway, Jeff has put this together, and we have with us a very eminent German politician. I should add that Jeff Gedman, our editor-in-chief, is a German expert, having done his PhD in the subject and having run the Aspen Institute in Germany and knowing a lot about Germany. So he prepared this event entirely. And thank you, Jeff. And thank you for the extraordinary job you're doing as editor-in-chief of this magazine and the impresario of all of these events, which have become very popular to the extent that we're now broadcasting them live on YouTube. So all of you on YouTube, welcome. And the way this is going to work in terms of the Q&A is that the YouTube audience, the questions you ask via the YouTube system will be forwarded to me, and then we'll work it out. We'll work it out that way. All right. Am I doing the moderating, or is that being picked up by someone else after the intro?
No, Carla's got that, and I'll get her the questions.
Carla's got the moderating.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. What a relief. Okay. I'm delighted not to have to do that.
Surprise, obviously.
Yes. Welcome everyone. Of course, I have to say as the publisher that it is obligatory, and we have ways of verifying this, that everyone in on this event is already a subscriber or becomes a subscriber to the American Interest within 10 minutes after the conclusion of the event. And this sort of a threat usually works, especially in the times we live in. This is the way commercial activity seems to take place a lot of the time, especially in certain countries. So without further ado, well, let me introduce Ralf, who's going to be speaking about Russia today. And as many of you know, Ralf is a very prominent German politician. Those of you who know about the history of the Green Party know of his role there. And he has now become an important force in Germany in pushing certain issues, and in particular, the issue that he's going to speak with us about today, which I will not say more about because that is his job. Our moderator, Carla and Robbins, is a contributing editor to the American Interest magazine, is kind of a friend of mine, I would hope to say, even though the last time we were to visit, it got messed up. I think I was sick. But anyway, sorry about that, Carla. Welcome. Carla writes frequently for the American Interest. She is very much an original thinker, which is sort of unusual for someone who purports to have been a journalist most of her life. She's had a very distinguished career in journalism. I had the pleasure years ago at a huge American Interest Freedom House event of her being one of the panel moderators at that, which I think was the first time I met her. And welcome, Carla. Very happy. I think this is the first American Interest event that you've moderated. I hope not the last. And now I'll shut up. Thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Charles and Jeff. And before we started this, I mentioned to Ralph that I'm utterly certain that I met Ralph 20 years ago when I was in Germany, and I'm utterly certain it's because Jeff sent me there, because when I worked at the Wall Street Journal and I did my reporting, and whenever I was in Germany, I went where Jeff told me to go. I'm an independent thinker, but certainly Jeff was a fabulous lead source and a great editor today. So thank you both so much. So we are going to move on to Russia, an obsession for all of us, but I did want to quickly do the news today because it is a weakness of mine. And so let's talk briefly about today's news and Ralph's read on the EU's new $857 billion stimulus package, which was engineered by Chancellor Merkel and Macron of France. which is after 5 days of pretty fierce brawling. So what's your read on this? Is this a sign of unity or at least some sanity post-Brexit? It's certainly far more generous and communitarian than we saw after the 2009 financial crisis. And with Merkel leading the way this time, they agreed to sell bonds collectively rather than individually. You know, there's more than half of the money is going in grants rather than loans, so they're not going to increase indebtedness. Or is it a reminder of the structural weaknesses and more trouble to come because they had to weaken important rule of law benchmarks on the funds to get Hungary and Poland on board? Once again, they're papering over all the problems of these intrinsically illiberal countries. So what's your read on this deal? And is there more trouble to come, or shall we be happy about this for a change in Europe?
I think at first hand, the most important message was that the EU is able to overcome its internal conflicts and contradictions and to keep going in a very difficult economical and political situation. It was a kind of typical EU compromise. Yeah? It's between different interests in different constellations within the European Union. We had, I would say, several overlapping lines of conflict and diverging interests. First, of course, between the economical, more prosperous countries, the donors within the EU, the net payers, and the highly indebted countries, which have been hit most hardly by the corona crisis at first hand, Italy and Spain. And on the other side, you had the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, and also Austria. Interestingly, Austria in a kind of black-green, conservative-green coalition. But there had been other lines of conflict, especially on the, I would say, the democracy issue, the rule of law issue, where Hungary and Poland are more and more drifting away from the basic consensus within the European Union. And one of the controversial issues had been how far, if and how far, these kind of financial aid should be linked to rule of law and basic democratic standards. And there was no final decision on that. It was a more kind of a compromise formula. Then you, of course, it was a game with very different institutional players. Yeah, you had Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. You had Mr. Michel, who is the president of the European Council, and then of course Angela Merkel and Macron. But the times are over when France and Germany could define European politics when they found a common ground, a bilateral compromise. So it's a really multilateral and very complex game going on, but that the EU finally, and those 27 states had been able to find a consensus, I think was extremely important. Otherwise, we would have seen stronger unraveling than tendencies within the EU. And structurally, this was, we are entering a new phase, because for the first time, the European Union itself is now empowered to deficit spending, to raise collateral debt on the responsibility of the EU, and on the other side to be able to pay back this debt, for the first time, the EU is becoming its own tax sources. So I think this is a kind of hesitant step into a new quality of a financial union. Chancellor Merkel said, oh no, this will not mean that the EU now is slipping into the slippery slope of a debt union. This is an extraordinary step in extraordinary times because of the corona crisis and the heavy economic fallout of this crisis. But of course, there are other forces in the EU, especially Macron and the southern countries, who want to see this exemption to become permanent.
So this is, I mean, it's, to me, it appears to be a rare bit of good news, although it is also a reminder of the structural limitations when you can be held hostage by Poland and Hungary. And once again, Article 7 means nothing, and the inability to punish the illiberal.
Law enforcement within the EU is weak.
Yeah.
It's true. We have very much stronger mechanisms for the democratic reforms and institutional reforms in the process of becoming a member of the EU. But when you have succeeded in full membership of the EU, then the means and mechanisms to enforce the basic democratic rules of the EU are quite weak.
So to transition to your very compelling article and about the relationship and potentially between Putin and Europe and the threat that Putin poses, it's somewhat reassuring to know that there's a certain vibrancy still in the EU. But you wrote this very compelling piece and you just deconstructed Putin's speech on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, which you describe as a revisionist call for a return to the concert of great powers. And you talked about how he conjured the Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill bending over the map of the world, and how he didn't say a word about the Helsinki Principles of 1975 or the 1990 Charter of Paris. And you also warned that Putin offered a new arrangement among the great powers, and you said it had a potential to drive a wedge into the EU and NATO. And you said that Macron in particular appeared susceptible to Putin's offers. You wrote, we should not delude ourselves about European autonomy. Without a tie to America to hold it back, Europe would slip even further into the gravitational field of the Kremlin. Even further into the gravitational field of the Kremlin. That's a pretty scary statement. And finally, you advocated, and perhaps I don't really understand where the Greens are on this right now, for a notably muscular response to Putin in the nuclear arena, an area I'm writing about right now for Charles and for Jeff. Europe will need a policy toward Russia that combines limited cooperation with the containment of neo-imperial ambitions. This includes responding to Russia's military buildup in the area of tactical nuclear weapons and to the violation of the INF treaty banning intermediate range missiles. It is imperative that Europe not become vulnerable to military extortion. Those are all very strong points. So my questions, and I'm sure everyone else here has questions about this. First, Putin may dream of being a great power, but other than its nuclear arsenal, and I don't underestimate 4,000 nuclear weapons, it has an extractive-based economy, a GDP smaller than Italy's, and conventional forces that lag hugely behind the US and to a great extent NATO's. So why do you see him as such a threat to Europe?
Maybe before we start going into the topic, I should say I'm not speaking as a representative of the German Green Party. You know, my times as an active party than politicians are over. Over the last 20 years, I ran the Green Political Think Tank, an international policy network, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and now I'm running an independent think tank in Berlin, the Center for Liberal Modernity, which is a little bit unfamiliar, let's say, for the typical green activist. So, okay. I think the Russian influence today is very much depending from the weakness of the liberal democracies. You are totally right that Russia seems to kind of a hollow giant. You know, of course, it's a mighty nuclear power, and it returned to a nuclear doctrine in which nuclear arms not only are serving as a mean of deterrence and as a weapon of last resort, no, it's becoming operationalized, especially tactical nuclear weapons and medium-range nuclear weapons. So this is a military threat in terms of the ability of blackmailing European states, especially the Baltics, maybe Poland, testing the solidarity within NATO and within the European Union. But this is only one part of this, the story. You are right that economically Russia didn't manage to modernize its economy. It's highly depending on the export of fossil fuels. This model is contradicting all climate aims of the Paris Agreement and of the international community. It never managed to thrive this kind of entrepreneurial spirit like China interestingly did. So China, meanwhile, has become a very strange combination of strong authoritarianism and economic innovation, technological innovation. Russia don't. Russia is a stagnant economic power or non-power. But given the crisis of the liberal democracies, I would say, on both sides of the Atlantic, you see it in the US and you see it in Europe, with all the internal conflicts, also within the European Union, the Kremlin managed to build up quite a significant political outreach, a political influence within Europe. And not only with businesses and parts of civil society, but also reaching out to parliaments and European governments, for instance, than Italy, Hungary, and others. And they build up a real propaganda empire with Russia Today and a lot of different media channels all the time firing disinformation and trying to distort public opinion in Europe. So I would say this is the main channel of influence of Russia Today, and vice versa. You have a lot of societal and political actors, a lot of voices in Europe, of course, also in the business community, who want to have a kind of rapprochement with Russia without any conditions, to go back to normal with Russia, to normal business relations, and to kind of political partnership, notwithstanding or ignoring both the internal repression in Russia and the foreign policy adventures, be it in Syria or in Libya or in Ukraine. So there is a kind of fertile soil for this kind of big alliance thinking. Macron is talking about Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Interestingly, not the old formula, the Euro-Atlantic community from Vancouver to Vladivostok. No, it's now about Lisbon to Vladivostok. And also in Germany, for instance, the former Chancellor Schröder, you have a lot of folks who are dreaming of this kind of Eurasian alliance. And some of them even see it as an alternative to the transatlantic alliance. And it will very much depend from the outcome of your next presidential elections. If these sentiments of these voices in Europe are getting stronger, forget about America. Yeah, we have to redesign our alliances, and we have to come to terms with Russia, because America is no longer a reliable ally for Europe.
See, and that is, I mean, that's sort of the question I want to ask, because you didn't mention, you know, the only mention you had about how important the US was to anchor, but you don't mention Donald Trump in your article at all. And maybe it's because he's Voldemort and he who must not be named, a la J.K. Rowling. Nevertheless, I mean, how much of what Macron is saying is, you know, the typical sort of French multipolarity and, you know.
Yeah, it's an old Gaullistic tradition, you know, this kind, yeah, multipolarity, equal distance, and the dream of France, again, playing the role of a big power on equal footing with Russia and then Washington. And of course, the status as a member of the Security Council of the United Nations.
But I, you know, maybe I'm naive, but I sort of always felt, you know, the French would say that, but ultimately they recommitted to NATO. And in the end of the day, I gave Macron a lot of credit for figuring out Russian disinformation pretty fiercely and a lot earlier than a lot of other people, including, I don't know if you saw that UK report that just came out saying that the, you know, the Brits have been ignoring the disinformation incursion from the Russians, you know, for years now. And you know, Macron was the first one, and I'm ambivalent as a journalist, but he was the first one to, you know, throw RT off his plane and do all these other things. I don't think Macron is, you know, unalloyed in the tank for Putin. So this raises this really fundamental question: how much of the talk of autonomy that you hear from France and also from Merkel is because of American abandonment? You don't talk about American abandonment in your article.
Yeah, because it's kind of it's an obvious fact that. Today, we can't make any predictions about the future of NATO as long as we don't know the political trajectory of the US after the elections. If Trump will be re-elected, for sure, the mistrust in Europe will grow, and the sentiment which of course has a big chunk of rationality, that we can't longer rely on the US as political partner, and the transatlantic alliance as an alliance of values, of shared democratic values and international common sense in the liberal international order. So this is not just, I would say, political fantasy. This talks about European autonomy. It's a kind of answer to the crisis of the transatlantic alliance. And I would say, even if we would see a revival of NATO and the political alliance between Europe and the US, which I would very much wish. Of course, Europe has to take more responsibility for its military security. That's clear, and this will also be the case with President Biden. The expectations that the Europeans, and especially the Germans, will no longer play this kind of game that others have to take for our security. But if this will happen within the transatlantic alliance or if we will see a decoupling between Europe and the US, this is an extremely crucial question. It's an old dream of Russia. It was a dream of the Soviet Union, and now it's a dream of the Putin power elite to deepen the split between the US and Europe, because this would open the floodgates for this kind of Eurasian alliance between Russia and the EU.
Can we, and I want to throw this open, but can we just do nuclear weapons very quickly here? Nuclear weapons in 60 seconds. So when you talk about Europe not being vulnerable to Russian military extortion, what are you advocating here? And I understand you're not talking for the Green Party, but I do, find the sort of green nuke thing quite interesting. Are you talking about more American tactical nukes rather than getting them out of Europe? Or are you talking about American intermediate range missiles in Europe now that we're out of the IMF? Who's going to host them? Do you have somebody who's volunteering for that? Are you talking about a larger European deterrent? I mean, that's what Macron was offering. He's offering a dialogue. He's not talking about, going to the Russian nuclear umbrella. He's saying, come into the French nuclear umbrella. And why is the US extended deterrent not enough to push back against the Russian extortion? If Biden is elected, he's going to need to find a way to revive the non-proliferation regime, which Trump has done enormous damage to. And one of the ideas is going to be, should we unilaterally get tactical nukes out of Europe?
Of course.
So are you calling for more tactical nukes in Europe, for keeping tactical nukes?
No, before we are talking about entering a new arms race, of course, we have to push very hard for a restart of weapons control talks, especially intermediary nuclear missiles, restoring the INF treaty, and in general to restore this kind of political negotiations between Russia and the West about arms control and kinds of disarmament, mutual disarmament. But the heated issue currently in Germany, and not only here, it's also in other European countries, is of course if we should get rid of the remaining US tactical nuclear weapons. And I think this would be a very silly move, decoupling Europe from the US in terms of nuclear deterrence. And this would increase our vulnerability for nuclear blackmailing by the Kremlin. My nightmare is not that Russia will start a kind of nuclear war against Europe and the West. This is not the thing we are talking about. No, it's about the ability of the Kremlin to escalate regional conflicts because they are commanding this kind of escalation dominance. Yeah, and they are superior than in every next step of a potential military confrontation than within Europe. And this would be a very rough test, I would say, for European and transatlantic security than solidarity. So I think keeping the US in is crucial for Europeans' security, and restarting the dialogue on arms control, but from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. This is also a lesson we can draw from the conflict on the medium-range nuclear weapons in the 80s.
So I'm going to throw it open here. We have a question here. Should I be reading, Demir, reading these questions? Or from
Well,
Alan?
Jeff has his hand up, and you can read those questions, yeah, if as you prefer.
But
Yeah.
I defer to Jeff, my editor.
I defer to Carla, my secret editor. And Carla, thanks for leading us. And Ralf, great to see you. And I hope sometime soon in person. I'm going to start where you two left off. Two parts to the question. One is the transatlantic decoupling that we see taking place right now. Of course, through the administration and the vision of Donald J. Trump, it's especially vulgar and radical. Ralf, the first question I have is, did you see any signs of this before, however, during the administration of George W. Bush and President Obama? And then the second part of my question is, now if I ask you, let's invite you to offer advice to President Biden, the standard European answer is, we don't meddle and it's not my place to say. But nevertheless, I think it would be very good for us on this call to hear from you advice to us about what we need to do to begin restoring confidence and cohesion in the alliance. You've touched on it with Carla, but I would be happy to hear more on that. And thank you, Carla.
Of course, there had been frictions and signs of entrenchment, I would say, between the US and the EU than before Trump. There was a whole series of events. The Iraq War was, I think, it was really the worst thing that could happen, not only for the transatlantic alliance, but for the credibility and let's say, the global outreach of the West and the trust in our Western institutions and in the responsibility of our governments. So, and there's a long, still, it's a long fallout from the Iraq War in mistrust and kind of the kind of a political crisis of the West, and also in the eyes of Asian and African countries. So, and of course, we had an ongoing, I would say, discussion. It was not a serious conflict on defense spending of the EU and especially of Germany. But I think the most important thing was that we didn't manage to restore a convincing narrative of what should the transatlantic alliance be about in the 21st century after the end of the Cold War. Yeah, what should be the political purpose? What should be the role of NATO? What is our vision for the new global order? And this lack of the political conversation and a political agreement, I think this was the basic ground for the crisis then happening with the election of Donald Trump. Then, of course, we had the conflict on trade. I think, especially in Germany, TTIP, the trade and investment agreement between the US and the EU was extremely disputed. And it was, I say, on both sides, on the US and on the European side, it was not handled very smart. So there are a lot of areas where we need a kind of restart and in a very comprehensive way. It's not only about military security. It's really about the purpose of the transatlantic alliance in a new era. There are frictions and conflicts, as you know, on the digital economy, the dominance of US digital corporations in Europe, the whole tax issue linked to the digital economy. So there is, I would say, a huge area of conflict, but also a huge area of opportunities to regain the spirit of transatlantic cooperation and transatlantic solidarity. And I would say it's even more necessary now in a new global constellation where we are confronted with a new systemic competition by authoritarian powers. Systemic competition is back. The Fukuyama moment from 1990, when he said end of history, which basically meant there is no systemic competition. Liberal capitalism has won it forever. This is the one and only global model. No, it ain't. And we have different shades of authoritarian regimes today, from China to Iran, and more also Turkey, and of course Russia, which are challenging the Western model and competing with the Western liberal order on a global scale. And interestingly, democracy promotion as a kind of main policy guideline of the West, this is gone. We are no longer doing regime change policies. It's the other way around, that China and Russia are actively undermining the integrity of our democratic systems. So I would say the need for a revival of the transatlantic alliance is urgent. And we have a lot of common interests, but we have to turn them into common policies. And this will be one of the main challenges of the hopefully newly elected American president. And also on the European side, we have to convince our audiences, we have to convince our political public that the transatlantic alliance is nothing of the past. No, that it is one of the really crucial political tools if we want to keep the momentum for liberal democracies globally.
Thank you.
Apologies. I love they are doing regime change image, and I don't love it, but it's quite a compelling argument. A man who knows a lot about regime change, David Kramer.
Oh, hello, David.
Thank you, Carla, and hello, Ralf. It's great to see both of you and everybody else. And thanks very much for taking the time to do this, Ralf, and my best to you and everyone there. I have two questions, if I can. The first is Putin winning, and if so, where? Or is it more that we are losing? How would you frame that? And the second question is, these protests in Khabarovsk that are now spreading to other parts of the East and Siberia, one shouldn't get too carried away with them, but they seem pretty serious. Reflect a regime that is out of touch with its population, that doesn't know how to capitalize on a rigged nationwide vote. Does that make Europeans nervous or hopeful?
Very good question. I'll start with the second one. I think there are two contradicting readings of these events in Europe, and especially in Germany. I would say the dominant discourse in Germany is still, we want to have stability in Russia. Yeah, so the unraveling of the Russian Empire, this is the biggest risk for European security. So we want to have stability, and this in this I would say dominant discourse. This means Putin is the better alternative. Yeah, Putin is we know what we have with him, but we don't know what would happen after a severe political crisis or even kind of political turnaround in Russia, if it will go into even more nationalist and more militaristic direction. This is, it could be. It's not for granted that political change in Russia will mean more democracy and a more peaceful and collaborative attitude towards Europe. So, but I think this kind of interpretation is misleading because it ignores the internal weaknesses and the elements of crisis in the current Russian system, and especially because of two major reasons, two major factors. First, the current regime, that's different, of course, to the old Soviet Union, has no alternative ideology. Yeah, it is no vision of a better society. So Russia has no political message to the world, not to its own citizens, and not to the European or the global public. It's and the second element, of course, is the economic weakness. I'm quite sure that the current economic model in Russia will slip into a crisis over the next decade, even more than today, when the export of fossil fuels, especially of oil and gas, and also of coal, will unravel. Yeah, if I think the current economic model of Russia is not sustainable. It has no future, and parts of the elites know that, but they don't have an answer to it, because it's not only about economic change. Changing the economy would demand also institutional reforms, and at least to a certain extent, rule of law, security for private property, and a certain range of pluralism. And this, of course, is something the Putin group is afraid of, because it would endanger their power and their privileges. So the events in Khabarovsk are really a very interesting signal on the wall, because the main impulse of the protests is against Moscow, yeah, against the dictatorship of the center. And it's the demand for more regional autonomy. It's a demand for more self-governance, for the better or for the worse. I'm not so sure about the political profile of the current governor, but it's a protest against the centralistic structure of the Russian regime, and this is questioning the whole architecture of the current political system. So we will see. I think Russia will face more political and social crises in the coming years, and the Europeans should not rely on the stability granted by Putin. I think this is an illusionary concept. We should do everything to strengthen, to support the democratic part of the Russian civil society, the NGO community, democratic intellectuals, the remaining independent media. And we should offer Russia a real partnership. Let's say a real partnership based on the political values which had been agreed by Russia in 1990. Yeah, Carla already mentioned the Charter of Paris. This was an agreement of 37 European nations, including the Soviet Union, and then later on also agreed by Russia on the principles for the new Europe. Yeah, the non-violence as a principle of conflict management in Europe, the equal sovereignty for all European states, democracy as the base of the political regimes, the respect for human rights. And this should be the framework for a real partnership between Russia and the West, including economic cooperation and support for economic transition in Russia. And I think we should be serious about that being critical on Putin is not being against Russia. We are not hostile to Russia. Yeah, but we have to defend ourselves against a regime which is trying to export its authoritarian model and which is undermining the European neighborhood. Yeah, look to Syria, look to Libya, look to Ukraine. This is nothing we could then agree with.
Can I just follow up on David's really quickly, and I want to get to Max, but every administration comes in and wants to reset relations with Russia. I mean, sort of, but we do have one more act before President Trump is voted out or not voted out, which is the G7 meeting. There probably will be a G7 meeting of some sort. And he seems determined to have Putin there. Not as a, I don't think he'll be able to have him there as a member, but perhaps as a, shall we say, as an honored guest. We have to engage the Russians on certain things. We need a New START extension. As you said, we need to at least make an offer to them to remind them of their commitments. You can't ignore them completely.
No.
So does it make sense to not show up? Merkel, we're talking about not showing up. I mean, maybe it's the virus, maybe it's something else. I mean, if Trump insists on having his bromance there by his side, do you recommend that everybody not come or come and give him a tongue lashing, or how do we handle it?
I would expect that the G7 simply cannot happen if there is no consensus on that issue.
No, but other
as long
players
I see, yeah, of course, Trump can maybe he would be so audacious to unilaterally then invite without a diplomatic then agreement in advance. But then I think the Europeans should show him a cold shoulder and not take part in this kind of electoral campaign then event. There had been very concrete and substantial reasons to disinvite Putin, to exclude him from G7. And as long as these reasons are in place, I don't think we should change the decision. But at the same time, I totally then agree we should not leave Russia then aside. This is simply impossible. The impact of Russia, the political impact, is just too big. We should try to engage Russia in arms control, negotiations on climate protection and climate policy, in talks on, of course, Ukraine and the European neighborhood. So in all kinds of issues between conflict and cooperation, we should be very active and offering alternatives to the current state of relations between Russia and the West. And I think this is the best we could do also to convince the Russian society that, yes, the West is a potential partner for you, but not to the conditions of the current regime.
Max, did I see you had a question? Is Max still with us?
I did, yes. And thank you both for being here. It's been incredibly interesting and informative. My question is a bit of a follow-up on Jeff's, and that is that with the transatlantic relationship and Joe Biden coming into power, ostensibly, possibly, he has a huge task in front of him to fix that. And is there any room for him to fix that relationship while also picking up on a gripe that President Trump had as a candidate and has had all through his tenure, that for the last few decades, NATO has not, or NATO partner countries have not been carrying their weight necessarily? Is there a way to get them to recommit to pay that 2% of GDP on military while simultaneously fixing the relationship? And as sort of an addendum to that, is he increasingly ambitious and threatening Russia in and of itself something that might solve that problem, with countries realizing the United States has turned inwards and that they may need to pick up some of the slack themselves?
My optimistic reading is, my optimistic guess is that Biden would have every authority and every credibility if he would come up and say, I want a revival of the transatlantic relations. For me, Europe is an indispensable strategic ally and partner. And then ask the Europeans, and ask especially Germany, please do more for our common security, and be serious in your responsibilities as the biggest European economic power, and I would say the leading European political nations. So I think this could also change the debate in Germany. Currently, the whole discussion on security policy and military spending is overshadowed by the conflict with Trump. Yeah, and so it's all. No, we will not fulfill the demands of Trump. No, we will not bow to his kind of blackmail. So, and I think a new president would have a chance to change the discourse. And I'm not sure how fast and how successful then it would be, because you have a strong undercurrent in Germany that military security is not our main concern. There are other much more pressing issues like climate change. We have to invest much more than money, and we cannot afford more military spending, and it's also not necessary. So the conversation maybe should start with a kind of reassurance: what are the purposes of NATO, and what kind of military capacities do we need to defend our security and defend our interests? yeah, but I hope very much for a new game.
So we have a limited amount of time. I'll go for my People magazine questions. So Merkel surprised me at this meeting. I mean, this is a very different Merkel from what we saw, as I said, after the financial crisis. She's championing all sorts of things that she would never have done before.
Yeah.
This is a very different, this is not the usual
It
abstemious.
was really a strategic move. It was a strategic move like she did in the refugee crisis in 2015, but then in a very unilateral way. So she didn't convince our European partners to, or the majority of them, to follow this pathway to a more open policy to refugees. And now she made a really substantial step beyond the up to now, I would say, mantra of the German policy: no collateral debt, no. The EU should not act as a financial entity of its own, and I think she really is very serious about the risks for the coherence of the European Union if we don't overcome this economic crisis, and especially if we don't overcome the economic imbalances within the European Union, between the countries like Italy and others, and the economic powerhouses on the other side within the EU. If we don't manage to bridge these economic discrepancies, this will be a risk for the political coherence of the EU. And I think now she's very serious that we have to go the next step. It's risky because parts of the European governments, they want to have financial solidarity and they want to keep their fiscal sovereignty. And of course, this is a contradiction in itself. So they have, Italy and Spain and others, they have to realize that more fiscal solidarity, more redistribution within the EU comes with certain norms, certain standards, and certain control mechanisms. So it's you have to give up a portion of your fiscal sovereignty, and this will allow the European Union to go the next step.
So lightning round, we have 2 minutes left. You talked about the impact inside the EU. How does this affect internal German politics? This is not the sort of way that, Germans don't like taking responsibilities for Southern Europe. What does this mean for German politics after Angela's gone?
Interestingly, today you have quite a strong consensus, I would say, within the democratic arrow of political parties, quite a strong pro-European consensus. And also, although this move of Angela Merkel again came very out of the blue, it came very quickly without a lot of consultation, without broad debate. She decided to change course, but there's very little controversy about it. So I think this pro-European stance of Germany will remain also after Angela Merkel's chancellorship.
Inshallah. Well,
because it's in our national interest too, in a kind of enlightened national interest of Germany. Of course, keeping the euro zone together, keeping the European internal market then going, and keeping the EU as a political alliance together. This is in Germany's interest. It's not the kind of idealistic charity. No, it's a kind of enlightened interest of Germany.
I'm going to say thank you. This has been fabulous. I love ending on the notion of enlightened national interest. I aspire to that for our country. I look forward to enlightened national interest again. I'm going to turn it back over to Damir and Jeff, and thank you very much for letting me play. I've learned an enormous amount, and I look forward to more of these events. Thank you so much, Damir.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Ralph, and thank you everyone for tuning in and for participating in this. Please do subscribe to the American Interest, www.the-american-interest.com. And yes, like Carla said, hope to see you again soon sometime. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carla.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ralph. Thanks,
Thanks,
Damir.
it was
Bye.
great. Thank you.